Hi, and thanks for joining the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. This is our fifth event in Lent term. My name is Raphael Fazel. I am the co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. Now, as those of you who have attended the Talking Animals series before will have noticed, there's a bit of a different look and feel to this event here, and that's because we have moved to a Zoom webinar, moving away from Zoom meeting. We had a bit of an incident recently. Anyone who was part of that event, we apologize for any inconvenience caused. So we decided to move to a bit of a different format. You won't be seeing one another, so attendees won't be seeing one another anymore, but you'll still be able to participate in the Q&A. And to do so, there is a Q&A function, which you will see at the bottom of the Zoom app. And you can pop in any questions you might have, any comments you might have into that Q&A box. You can also upvote comments or questions that other people have put in there, or add comments to them. And once we reach the Q&A part, I can then feed those questions to our speaker, and we can have a bit of a discussion that way around. So this is how the format works. Timing-wise, everything will remain the same. We will have a presentation lasting somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes, and we will end at 6:30 p.m. UK time. We are again recording this event, so if you'd like to watch it later, you can find it uploaded to our YouTube channel and website in due course. So with all this out of the way, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our excellent speaker today, and that's Jérôme de Hemptinne. He's an assistant professor at Utrecht University. He previously worked for nearly 2 decades at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, as well as the Office of the United Nations Legal Council in New York and the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. He is the author of the book Les conflits armés en mutation, and he is a co-editor of Modes of Liability in International Criminal Law, published with Cambridge University Press in 2019. And perhaps particularly important for our purposes here, he's also the co-editor of the book Animals in the International Law of Armed Conflict, which came out 3 years ago with Cambridge University Press. In his presentation today, he will talk to us about the protection of animals during warfare. Jérôme, thank you so much for being with us. And if you can just unmute yourself, then we can... we can't hear you yet, Jérôme, I'm afraid. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you, yes.
Okay, thanks a lot. Also, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me to participate to this webinar. Thanks a lot, Raphael. Thanks also to the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. It's for me a pleasure, and thanks a lot for all of you attending this webinar. Unfortunately, I'm not able to see you, but I will do my best to explain you a few things regarding the protection of animals during warfare. And as Raphael just mentioned, we, and Peters, Robert Kolb, and me worked on this issue. We wrote a book. If you don't have time if you are interested by the question and don't have time to read the book, we have, and Peters and myself, we wrote an article in the International Review of the Red Cross, and I can provide you a link to this article which summarized the book. And if you don't want to read the article, you can read a blog post that we wrote on this in a warfare blog post, and I can also send it to you should you wish. So it's a quite a short blog post, and it explains in fact everything. So what I will try to do, and I'm not a specialist of animal law, in fact, I'm more a specialist of the laws of warfare. So if I speak too fast, if you have any questions on the laws of warfare, of course, feel free to intervene. It's a very special body of law with its own parameters, which sometimes are not easy to grasp. But I will do my best to explain you the general framework, and especially how animals are protected in this context. How I will do so, first of all, I will try to answer a basic question. Why simply the laws of warfare, international humanitarian law, should care about protecting animals? Humans are killed on a widely basis during warfare. Goods which are very important for humans are widely destroyed. So animals is the least priority for humans. So why caring about animals in those circumstances? And I'll try to outline two types of considerations. First of all, more theoretical consideration, more legal consideration, which I think are important, but also some more practical reasons. Yes, animals are also suffering during warfare. And I will try to show briefly why this is in fact a really important matter. Then I will briefly present how the laws of warfare in fact do provide some sort of protection to animals. Even if it's not a priority for the laws of warfare, you can deduce from different conventions, from different provisions of the conventions, some sort of protection to animals. There are some protections which are, I would say, uncontroversial. They are easy to apply to animals. They are more controversial protection. And I'll try to explain them and how they are more controversial. I think some of them can easily be solved. And then the final question will be, but so the laws of warfare protect animals to a limited extent. How can we ameliorate this body of law? How should, in reality, international humanitarian law protect animals? And we will see that certain provisions can be interpreted in a dynamic manner to better integrate the necessity to protect animals. And we could also think about signing a new treaty on this question. This might appear a bit bizarre to you. It might appear to be bizarre to think about adopting a treaty which would protect animals while states can't even agree on developing new laws to protect certain means of warfare, such as drones. I will try to explain that this might be possible, that it might be a possibility on which a state could agree. So 3 questions. Why the laws of warfare should care about animals? Then how the laws of warfare do protect currently animals? And then the third question, how the system as it currently exists could be ameliorated to better take into consideration the fact that animals are sentient beings and would deserve a protection as such. Let's start with the first question. Why should IHL care about animals? When I say IHL, it means International Humanitarian Law, the laws of warfare. First, there are some theoretical reasons. I would like to make first two initial observations. It will not surprise you that if you look at the convention which regulates how hostilities should be conducted and how individuals are protected in those circumstances, these conventions are very much anthropocentric. And there is nothing on animals. There is very few provisions which protect the environment. So animals, they are indirectly protected through certain provision on the environment, but that's basically it. And this is not surprising when the laws of warfare were adopted just after the Second World War in 1949. In 1949, 4 main conventions were adopted to protect persons who are particularly vulnerable in those circumstances. The prisoners of war, the civilian and persons who are wounded and sick. At that time in 1949, the protection of animals, even during peacetime, was not a big issue. So let's forget about the situation of animals during warfare at the time. In 1977, during the period of decolonization, two additional important conventions were adopted, which are called the Additional Protocol to the Geneva Convention of 1949. And there are some interesting development, especially given the fact that in those conventions, the environment is protected, especially after what happened during the Vietnam War and the destruction by the forest, by the famous Orange Agent. So there was some concern to increase the protection of the environment, and that helped also to protect animals. So, as I said, the priority at the time was to protect humans. Humans are terribly suffering in all types of warfare, not only in Ukraine, not only in Gaza, but in all the conflicts which are currently taking place in Africa. For instance, the newspaper do not talk much about what is going on for the time being in South Sudan, but in the Sudan itself. But within the last year, there's around, I don't know, between 50,000 to 100,000 civilians were killed. And unfortunately, the media does not talk much about that. The situation in Congo is catastrophic. The situation in Mali or in other areas are terrible too. That doesn't mean, of course, that the situation in Gaza and in a situation in Ukraine is not also terrible. So humans are suffering very much, and therefore the entire regime which regulates warfare has been devoted to the protection of human first. Now, you will say, if animals are killed on a widely basis during peacetime, mainly for food consumption, why caring about the few animals which are killed during warfare because of the bombing of certain areas? Why caring? And while at the same time, also, as I just mentioned, humans are suffering to a large extent. And I think there are a few reasons to go beyond this kind of paradox. Society should move towards an increased protection of animals. The fact that animals are killed on a widely basis during peacetime for food consumption does not justify that animals should be killed during warfare. In fact, the violence which is imposed to animals during warfare is very much different from the violence which is imposed to animals during peacetime. I'm not saying that the violence which is imposed to animals during peacetime is justified. I don't agree with that, but still, these are very different types of violence. The violence which is imposed upon animals during peacetime is considered to be legitimate. Again, I don't agree with that, but it's progressively limited. So international law should also move towards an increased protection of animals during wartime. I think it should follow a similar trend. Restrictions should progressively be imposed to increase the protection of animals during warfare, and this is also developing during peacetime. And contrary to what is often said, I don't think that protecting animals during warfare has necessarily an impact on the protection of humans. These are totally two different things. It's not because you protect animals that you don't protect humans. I think you should separate the two issues. And if at some point it becomes difficult to protect both, okay, I can understand that priority should be given to humans. But I think they can run in parallel. If you, for instance, talk to members of the International Committee of the Red Cross, they might say, listen, our priority is not to protect animals. We have other consideration. We have already very much, we are confronted to huge difficulties to protect humans. We cannot also devote time and energy to protect animals. That I understand perfectly. But there are many other organizations, for instance, the United Nations Environmental Programs, or there are specific charity organizations whose role is specifically to protect the environment and also animals. So I think these two things should not be confused. What is also interesting from a theoretical perspective is that there is quite a correlation between welfare, animal law, and international humanitarian law. And I think there are bridges that can be established between these two bodies of law. Both bodies of law do not prescribe as such violence. Violence is not completely prohibited during warfare. Humanitarian law starts with the fact that there is a situation of violence, and in this complex situation of violence, certain protection should be entrusted to those who are not participating to this violence. It's the same thing for the welfare laws on animals. They do not completely prescribe violence, but they organize in a certain way this violence. So there are bridges between these two bodies of law, and that might help interpreting international humanitarian law in light of these welfare law, as they in fact function in a similar manner. These are the main, I think, theoretical reasons which I think are important to have in mind when we think about protecting animals during warfare. Now, more concretely, of course, there are many important reasons to think about the protection of animals during warfare. Warfare has a huge impact on humans, on civilian goods. Lots of destruction are happening, but also, of course, this destruction causes direct damage to animals. Animals are killed on a widely basis during warfare. They are killed directly, they are also killed indirectly. There's a lot of pollution which occur during warfare. I don't know, when you use these weapons today, these weapons contain very toxic and dangerous materials which will go into the water and therefore impact the environment and impact wildlife. That goes without saying. Biodiversity zones, in fact, this is important to mention that there was a study which was made by some American researcher, and basically they have said that over the last 50 years, 80% of the armed conflict which have taken place during this period touched or had impact on high biodiversity zones. So most of the conflict do have an impact on high biodiversity zones where fragile flora and also endangered species are located. So it has a huge impact on these species. And especially given the fact that what happens also during warfare is that you have a lot of illicit trafficking. A lot of illicit trafficking because simply the state is unable to control certain areas. And so therefore endangered species are widely killed for many different reasons, for their fur, for their how do you say that, the horns and everything. And this is a very lucrative market. It generates billions of dollars each year, mainly animals coming from Africa to the south of Europe, and then they go and they are sent to Asian countries. And that, of course, is very important during warfare because it helps at the same time armed group, but also state armed forces to finance the acquisition of weapons, for instance, through the trafficking of these animals. And to a lesser extent, but it's still important to mention that animals are also used during warfare. The US have, and also Russia has a program by which they are using animals like dolphins in order to be able to detect mines or to protect certain harbors. And so, of course, these animals which are used for that purpose are very much at risk. But beyond that, of course, armed groups in Africa, they're using horses, they're using camels to transport their own troops. So they are very much used also during warfare. You remember that during the Second World War, for instance, pigeons were used to to send messages, or for instance, dogs are used to rescue wounded soldiers. So there are many animals that are used as weapons of war. So these, I think, are the main practical reasons which justify caring about animals during warfare. In a nutshell, simply animals are suffering very much during warfare. They are suffering by given simply that warfare is very violent, and that very much lots of destruction occur during these unstable period. Now, having said this, let's briefly look how international humanitarian law, the laws of warfare, treat the question of animal. I told you the question of animal is certainly not a priority for the laws of warfare. But still, if you look at the different provision of the famous Geneva Convention that I just mentioned, the famous convention which protect individuals who are vulnerable in time of warfare, civilians, prisoners of war, and persons who are wounded and sick. Or if you look at the conventions which regulate how warfare should be conducted, the additional protocol, what belligerent can do. They have to respect certain principles when they launch attack, principle of proportionality, principle of distinction. They have to distinguish between military objective and civilian objective. All this is regulated. And you can distill from these different conventions certain provisions which are interesting for animals. First of all, there are uncontroversial protection, the environment itself. The environment itself is protected as a civilian good. Civilian good in principle, you cannot attack them. You cannot attack, let's say, for instance, an airport. An airport is in itself a civilian good. It should not be the object of destruction, except if it is used, for instance, by the military. Then it can become, under certain conditions, a military objective. This is the same thing for the environment. In principle, you cannot attack a forest, except if, for instance, in the forest, troops are located. And then you will have to measure the attack that on the forest, that it will the attack, on these military objective, on these soldiers, would have on the forest itself. It should not be disproportionate. But there is one additional protection which is very important for the environment. You can never launch an attack which will cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the environment. So even if you have an important military objective for instance, in a forest, you can never target this military objective if this will cause this widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the environment. And of course, animals are part of the environment. The wildlife, but also you could consider that pets are part of the environment. Livestock are part of the environment, and therefore they will benefit from this general protection. The big problem with this protection, without going too much into details, is that this protection only applies in international armed conflict. So it's only when a state attacks another state that this state should not cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the environment. So if there are military operations that are conducted within a state in a situation of civil war, when states are fighting armed groups within their own territory, the laws of warfare do not say anything about this. In fact, when the state negotiated the conventions, they didn't agree. They said, listen, when we are fighting armed group on our territory, rebels which are trying to destabilize us, this is our business. Therefore, if we want to destroy our environment, the laws of warfare has nothing to do with this. Of course, we realize now that it's not because you only destroy your environment that this cannot have widespread repercussion on related ecosystem. But still, there is no consensus to protect the environment in non-international armed conflict, and lots of conflict today are oppose state to armed groups or armed groups between themselves, and therefore also impact the environment and the animals which are part of this environment. So that's a big limitation. The other big limitation is these terms, widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the environment. These have usually been interpreted very restrictively by a state. For instance, long-term has to be measured in decades. If you look at the travaux préparatoires of the additional Protocol 1, which contain this provision, you see that states were not very much inclined to protect very well the environment. Now, you can look at this provision with a different eye. International environmental law has developed a lot over the years, and so therefore you can interpret this provision in a much more progressive manner. For instance, if you destroy an endangered species, which is located in a very relatively very narrow area, and you destroy only this area, you might say, oh, that this is not widespread. But in reality, now we know very well that if you destroy this endangered species, even if you destroy it in a very narrowly defined area, this will have huge repercussions on the ecological system, and therefore, in fact, can have a much wider impact than the simple destruction of this specific area. So there are ways to interpret these norms to better protect the environment and indirectly animals, and especially certain type of animals such as endangered species, but still the protection remains quite limited. There is another provision in the laws of warfare which protect animals which are indispensable for the survival of civilian population, and which protect all goods, in fact, which are indispensable for the survival of population, is mainly, in fact, the food. And as animals are eaten, and of course, the civilian population is it's an important priority. Animals have been protected in this way. Livestock is protected in this way. Of course, us who care about animals, we see that the protection is not very good. In reality, we only protect them from being killed by the belligerent, but ultimately it's in order that they be eaten by humans. So again, the protection is quite limited, but this should be mentioned because this is one of the only provision which refer to certain types of animals like livestock. Now, more controversial protection is not very controversial, but it's a bit more controversial. Don't worry, I won't be speaking too long, but just a few words about this. First of all, civilian object. Civilian object, that's very important because during warfare, as I mentioned earlier, you cannot destroy any civilian object. You cannot destroy a bridge, you cannot destroy a road, you cannot destroy a school, you cannot destroy an airport or whatever. And these are all civilian objects. You will be able to target them under very limited conditions when they become military objective. For instance, when a road is used by the military. But there are very narrow conditions which are outlined in the convention itself. It must be a direct and concrete a military objective. The wording is such that it is relatively limited. The question is to what extent animals should be considered as civilian object. If you look at the travaux préparatoires of the convention, it mainly refers to inanimate object. Now, I would say that there is no very much disagreement to include among these civilian object animals. There are many reasons for that. The first reason is this, is that it's difficult to treat animals as persons. I will try to make this argument later on, but you will see it's very difficult. So therefore, if it's difficult to treat animals as persons, they need to be protected in some ways. The purpose of humanitarian law, there's no gap in protection according to humanitarian law. So if you can't be a person, you need to be an object. At least these are the two categories, the only two categories that exist under humanitarian law. So they should benefit from this protection. And this is very important, as I just mentioned, because in that way, in principle, they can't be targeted. And animals are treated as objects in many jurisdictions around the world. So I don't think it is that difficult to interpret civilian object to encompass animals. Okay, but as I just mentioned, as object, animal can be targeted except when they qualify as military objective. They will rarely qualify as military objective. They could qualify, for instance, when they are used to transport the military. In that, they might become military objective. There is an important principle during warfare which might have a huge impact on animals is the principle of proportionality. I'm not going to go too much into detail about this, but I just mention in passing because this is quite important. If you target a military objective during warfare and you cause collateral damage to humans, but also to civilian objects, therefore including to animals, this is not going to be considered necessarily as illegal. In fact, there is this principle of proportionality. It is acknowledged that during warfare, it's very difficult to predict the consequence of an attack. So therefore, the one who launch an attack has to measure, to balance the two interests which are at stake. On the one hand, targeting the military objective, the advantage that it will gain from this attack, the military advantage, and on the other hand, the damage that is going to be caused to humans, to the environment, but also to animals. And so you have to weigh these two interests. It depends. Of course, that might vary a lot in function of the societies in which you are. There are, in certain societies, certain type of animals are very important. Cow in India, for instance, are more important than they might be here in Europe. So in that case, they might play a very important, they might have a very important weight in this balancing exercise. Endangered species certainly will carry an important weight. Anyway, this is very relative, but it is important to mention. Now, I just mentioned that very quickly, medical equipment and means of transportation, and they are protecting it during warfare. In fact, as the medical units which are there to protect, they are there, in fact, to help persons who are wounded and sick, especially wounded soldiers. And there are two conventions which are devoted to that, Geneva Convention 1 and 2, to the protection of persons who are wounded and sick, and also to the protection of persons who are carrying out military activities, and their equipment is also protected. For instance, an ambulance to carry the person who is wounded or sick is protected. And it's protected in the sense that not only you should not target this object, but also you should guarantee that they be able to be used in order to carry out their military, their medical function. Now, to what extent animals could benefit from this protection? It's interesting for certain types of animals which are used in those circumstances. Animal can be used to transport persons who are wounded because of warfare. Dogs can be used in order to sniff, to find out where persons are located, persons who are wounded, and they are often used for this purpose. So the question arises as to what extent they could benefit from this additional protection. Again, if you look at the laws of warfare, you will see that these are mainly inanimate object, but I don't think that it's difficult to interpret them in such a way to include animal, because the idea behind the protection is a purpose use oriented definition. These objects are not protected in themselves, they are protected because of the medical function assigned to them. So if you assign a medical function to animal, I presume that you could consider that they are either medical unit, part of medical units, or medical transport. I mentioned that in passing. It's true that does not concern many animals, but still, this is, I think, interesting. Now, just quickly mention cultural property. Cultural property, this is also an interesting thing because cultural property are not only protected by additional Protocol 1 to the 4 Geneva Convention adopted in 1977. There's one provision in this regard, but they are also conventions on the protection of cultural property. That is one convention that adopted in 1954, plus two additional protocol one, including two additional protocols, to this convention, including one which apply during non-international armed conflict, during civil warfare. And this is a very interesting type of protection because you can never target cultural property, or you can target them under very limited conditions if there are imperative reasons of military necessity. So these objects are very well protected. Now you may say, Jérôme, this is beautiful, but cultural property is an object. Does it include animal? Now, I would say, first of all, it's not easy to distinguish the cultural heritage from the natural heritage. And usually they are very much linked. I don't know, certain monuments are usually very much intertwined to the environment in which they are. So in that way, it can ensure the protection of animal. Also, a cultural value is attached to certain animals, which are employed for, I mentioned here, religious rites or for traditional food or sport, or some of them enjoy a totemic status. So in that way, I think they could benefit from this protection. Or a special cultural value is attached to endangered species. And therefore, endangered species, I think they could be well treated as cultural property, or if not as such, at least the habitats in which they live. So indirectly, they could benefit from this protection. I mentioned that here the World Heritage Convention recognized that habitat of threatened species of outstanding universal value from the point of view of science or conservation form part of the common heritage of humankind. Of course, this offers only a limited protection to certain type of animals, but it's worth mentioning that because these are animals who are endangered, and as I mentioned earlier, many conflicts are taking place in a high biodiversity zone where these type of animals are located. So under this system, as I just mentioned, you can never target animals except if imperatively required by military necessity, and this is really restrictively interpreted. Now, let me finalize my presentation. Oh, I just mentioned quickly that animal in protected zone, that's also quite interesting. Not go too much in detail, but just mention that in passing that belligerents can agree to constitute protected zones during warfare. What does it mean? It's simply zones where they agree that no hostilities will take place. So one belligerent say, okay, I will not put military objective in this zone, and the other belligerent say, okay, there is no military objectives in this zone, so therefore I will not target them. And usually these zones, if you look, there are many provisions on this protective zone, have been designed to protect areas where you have densely populated areas, where you have lots of big civilian population, or for instance, to protect hospitals or this type of zone. Of course, these zones, as you find them in the convention, are there to protect humans. They have not been envisaged to protect animals. But that could well apply, I think, to the environment, certain areas, and could well also include areas where you have certain type of animals or any type of animals, because basically it all depends on the agreement between Belgium, and Belgium can agree to whatever they want, especially if it's to increase protection either of individuals but also of the environment and of animals. Unfortunately, the system does not work very well. It's not a prescriptive system in the sense that there is no obligation which is placed upon belligerents to create this zone. They have to agree to that. Before warfare, usually they don't agree because they cannot anticipate where hostilities are going to take place, and therefore they don't create these zones in time of peace. When warfare occurs, of course, they fight against each other, so they don't agree to create this zone. It can happen, and it has happened in the past, in certain war in the former Yugoslavia, but this has limited impact. However, I think this is a system that should be developed. Protected zones are very important to protect the environment in peacetime, and should be a system that should be, I think, developed also during warfare. I have some ideas on this. Now, let me quickly finish by trying to outline some perspective. How to increase the protection of animals, which, as you can see, is quite limited. National laws are evolving a lot. More and more animals are treated as sentient beings. So more and more restrictions are imposed upon humans when they carry, transport, or kill animals. Unfortunately, the world is still allowing that animals be killed on a massive scale. Just in France, on a daily basis, 3.6 animals are killed. For me, it's absolutely unacceptable. I think, I don't know, when I think about that, the killing of animals in peacetime for food consumption is something beyond. I'm sure that we will be judged in a couple of generations, and this generation will say how cruel we are with animals. But this is beyond this talk. Public opinions is changing. You look at the situation in Ukraine, there's a lot of broadcasts which have been made on people leaving the war with their pets and blah, blah. More and more, we understand, it is understood by the public opinion that animals are suffering, zoos are completely destroyed, and there's no reason to do that. Now, how do you do it? There are many different ways of doing it. Either you treat animals as persons. And of course, persons are very well protected during warfare. They are protected also because they suffer. Their suffering is protected as such. So you could say, but why not? You could say that even more that, in fact, if you look at IHL, humanitarian law is there to protect individuals. It does not as such give much rights to individuals during warfare. It's more a body of law which protect individuals who are vulnerable. So as it does not give much right, it does give rights in reality, right to reparation and all this. But so that can easily be transposed to animals and applied to animals. If there is no right at stake, the question of animal rights is much more complex. But here is mainly about protection. And as you know, under national law, the status of person is granted to certain abstract entities such as corporations. So why not giving that to animals? In reality, it does not work very well. Because if you look the way the conventions are mentioned, are organized, they are organized in this way. You have Geneva Convention 3, which protect prisoners of war. Basically, these are soldiers who are participating in warfare. They are arrested, and so they need to receive some protection. And all those who are not prisoners of war, who are not belonging to armed forces, they should be treated as civilians, and they benefit to protection as civilians. And you have only these two categories. And of course, if you are part of the military, you can be killed during warfare, and civilians can never be killed except if they participate in hostilities. And this entire system doesn't work very well for animals. Animals do not participate like humans in warfare. They can be involved during warfare, but not consciously. They don't decide to themselves participating in warfare. They are used by humans. The entire rationale of protection of a prisoner of war does not work very much. Prisoner of war, they can be detained until the end of the hostilities in order to prevent them from participating again in hostilities. And they have to be treated very humanly. They cannot be prosecuted for the fact that they participated in the hostilities because they had a right to fight. So they are immune. All this doesn't work for animals. Animals, you're not going to arrest them and put them in the detention, in administrative detention, to prevent them from participating against in hostilities. And if you look at this internment regime, you will see there are many rules on discipline, closing, rank, interrogation, all this that does not apply to animals. And the question of immunity of combatant, the fact that animals do not deliberately join armed forces, knowing that this could lead to lethal consequences. So the prosecution of animals who would commit war crime, all this does not really work. So the distinction between civilians and prisoner of war do not work very well. So it's difficult to transpose the system of protection of person during warfare to animal and to apply it as such. So therefore, what can we do? Give me another 2 minutes and then it's over. We can simply try to interpret the norms of IHL in a more animal way. In light of all the conventions which protect animals. There are not that many conventions, but in light of customary principle, if we can deduce them from the practice of state. There is one very important clause that you find, for instance, in additional protocol 1 is the Martens clause. And the Martens clause says this. It says that if humanitarian law does not foresee something, there's one principle which should apply. This is the principle of humanity. People should always be treated humanly. And that can be interpreted in a progressist manner. I know Alan Peters like that a lot, and I think it does make sense. Now it has been interpreted by the International Committee of the Red Cross to include the environment, but why not? The principle of humanity could also be principle of animality. This all is linked. Humanity is not something that should be separated from the environment in which human lives, especially during warfare. And that could lead to a more animal way of interpreting certain norms. And for instance, if you use this principle of interpretation, you could say, for instance, that animals should never be used for military purpose, or that during combats, animals should, as much as possible, be captured instead of being killed. There is no reason to kill them like military forces. They should not be no weapons should be used against them, which would cause unnecessary suffering. Not only unnecessary suffering to humans, but also unnecessary suffering to animals if we treat them as sentient beings. If they are sentient beings, in the proportionality calculation, I told you that when you target a military objective, it is accepted that collateral damages are caused. But if they are sentient beings, maybe they should carry a bit more weight than a simple object which do not have these characteristics. That could have also an impact for endangered species, which, as I mentioned earlier, should be treated as cultural properties, or protected zones should be established to protect humans. So there are many ways to interpret current IHL norms in light of the fact that in many jurisdictions around the world, animals are treated not only as simple objects, but as sentient beings. And this would impact the application of these norms. Let me finish my presentation by outlining a last proposal, signing a new treaty which would grant animal rights. A priori, you will say, we should not think about that. Why giving rights to animals? While, first of all, international humanitarian law is also a protective body of law. It does not as such grant rights to individuals. In fact, it's more complex than that. It also grants some rights to individuals. There's always the same debate that you probably know, why granting rights to animals when they cannot respect obligations. Or we can go beyond that quite easily, but still this is often mentioned. Would providing rights to animals would be against human interest? I don't think so. Or if it would be against human interest in certain situations, then you can give priority to human interest. And as you know, very few countries grant rights to animals. So I don't think there is any customary principle in this regard. So that's why a convention should be adopted. And this would have, of course, huge implication. First of all, it would have symbolic value. It would emancipate animals from the guardianship of humans. They would be treated for themselves. And also, more importantly, during warfare, they would be in a better position in the many international humanitarian law trade-off between humanitarian consideration and military contention, which often come into play. Human would have to justify a restriction imposed on animals if they would have such a right. Now, where that could matter, you will say, principle, military interests are at stake, and there is no possibilities that such a treaty be adopted. I think there are two rights which could create some consensus. First of all, the prohibition of using animals for military research. Animals are used on a wide-body basis to test weapons, to design and test weapons. I think that might be something on which an agreement could be reached at some point, but that might be also difficult. Of course, we cannot use animal, and we cannot use, Belgium cannot use weapons which cause unnecessary suffering, and therefore they do test to what extent unnecessary is caused. But there are many other ways to do it, and I don't think that animals should be the object of these tests. And then maybe at some point, prohibiting using animals during warfare. The fact that the US has a program to use dolphins or especially in Western states where now you have that all Belgians use technical means which can overcome some difficulties they were facing before, and which may have justified the use of animals in the past. I'm sorry, I spoke a bit too fast as usual, and I spoke a bit too quickly, but I hope that at least you have a general overview of this interesting question, I think. Thank you for your attention.